So we are looking at week number 23 and event number 46 and 47. And I have titled this as Jesus, the healer. But since this is a controversial healing, and healing itself is a controversial topic with many questions, many confusions, and I thought we will take some time to think through this and to address it slowly and in detail. Yeah. So last week we looked at the Sabbath controversy of the disciples trying to pluck, this corn and eat corn on the Sabbath day and all of that. Today, that narrative is continuing on the same Sabbath day. This is what is happening. But before that, a little letting into the Sabbath controversies. There are specifically several Sabbath controversies that are deliberately recorded in all the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So we already looked at the disciples plucking ears of grain in Galilee. And earlier we looked at Jesus healing a paralytic at the pool of Bethesda, which is in Jerusalem south. Galilee is in the north, as we all know. And today, Jesus is healing a man with a withered hand in the district of Galilee, again, specifically in Capernaum. And that's what we're going to study. And there are a few other Sabbath controversies also. And so this is an important topic whenever we speak about Jesus, especially so when we are trying to speak to Jewish people. And if anybody ever has a friend who is a Jew, we do know how difficult it is to converse, and they don't readily see Jesus as the Messiah, though there are Messianic Jews. So understand the background as to why there is this very strong pushback about the person of Jesus, because he seems to be a blaspheming lawbreaker as a typical Orthodox Jew would look at it. So there's a lot of countercultural things that Jesus is doing. Quote unquote counter mosaic thing that Jesus is doing. Jesus is upsetting the cart. Jesus is, really shifting the balance. And so there's a lot of struggle that happens to a Orthodox Jew when he encounters this Jesus of the Gospels. Okay. Now here we go. Event number 46, episode 23, titled it as the Sabbath healing. We are in Matthew chapter 12, verses 9 to 14 first, and then if time permits, we'll look at the rest of the verses. And there are parallels of this particular narrative given in Mark and given in Luke. Mark 3, 1 to 6, Luke 6, 6 to 11. So verse 9 in Matthew 12 goes like this. Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue. And a man with a shriveled hand was there looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus. They asked him, the Pharisees are asking him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Just before that, they had riddled him with this question that we saw last week about how wrong it was for his disciples to be eating on the Sabbath. And then Jesus gives an amazing answer. But they are still continuing to follow him, still continuing to dog him, still continuing to trap him, and to see what he is actually doing to fault him on that next, because this was happening on the Sabbath day, technically the day of rest. And Jesus was seemingly moving with his entourage of disciples in the field, and now they are waiting to see what the next controversy is that they could create. Okay. Now, again, as I told you, this happened in Capernaum. This happened in the district of Galilee. And we know that Galilee is northern part of Israel, and Judea is the southern part. The Galilee is called as the Galilee of the Gentiles. That seems to be Jesus's initial headquarters, and that's where a lot of his disciples, at least 4 or 6 of them, came from. So Galilean ministry of Jesus is an important ministry. It's a ministry where even the Gentiles came and watched and saw what Jesus did and said, right? Now, I'm calling this slide as the emergency medicine slide because in the Mishnah, which is a commentary of the Pharisaical laws, the Pharisees believed that it was permissible to give medical assistance on the Sabbath day. That is their extrapolation of the Mosaic law. So they thought, according to the Mishnah, which was the commentary on the law, that it was permissible to give medical assistance on the Sabbath only if a sick person's life was in danger. Okay, so that is their understanding, that's the background with which we are approaching this passage. The second important thing is that the Mishnah also permitted CNC services. What is CNC services? Childbirth services and circumcision services. So to a Pharisee of that day, the oral tradition was, or the interpretation of the law was, that it is okay to save life on Sabbath critical services and to allow childbirth on Sabbath. So midwifery was allowed, and circumcision also was allowed on the Sabbath, but nothing more, right? And in this context, what is happening is that Jesus is trying to go and heal a person who was not critically ill and heal a person who did not, in their assumption or in according to their law, require attention. So the big phrase in every Jewish mind at that particular point in time in the synagogue that was watching to see what Jesus would do next was exestai, which means, is it lawful? Is it lawful? Is it lawful? This is the common refrain in a Jewish mind, in an Orthodox Pharisaical mind, all of the time. Because they were so law-bound, and their commitment to the law was almost bordering on an obsession to try and uphold the law. They were the moral policemen of their day, just like a mutawa in Saudi Arabia perhaps might be morally policing people about not wearing burqa or doing any requirement that the country and the religious laws of the country required. So what's the big question always going on in the Pharisees' mind? Exestai. Is it lawful? Is it lawful? Is it lawful? Okay. And we see how little impression Christ's word regarding mercy that he made in last week's study about mercy being better than sacrifice had made it. It had literally not made any impact on them because they were considering law and they were committed to keeping the law, and this was their religious scruple. This was their religious scruple. Okay? And they are continuing, therefore, to ask this question, is it lawful? And they're not asking the more important question that Jesus wanted them to ask, which is it merciful? Is it merciful? And here Jesus wants to teach us a lesson to ask the right question. And Lenski, the theologian, seems to be speaking about this and getting this very, very right. Now let's move to verse number 11. Verse 11 says, he said to them, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? Now, since we are reading the Gospels and then we are reading the Gospels with, a magnifying glass, we're doing micro reading and we are trying to really, really zoom in on the person of Jesus, I think it's important for us to observe every word that comes out of Jesus' mouth, the questions and the answers. Now, all of us know that Jesus is the answer. Oh, it's a famous thing. There's a song that says, Jesus is the answer for the world today. Somebody humorously asked, if Jesus is the answer, what is the question? Okay. But here we see right through the gospel, Jesus is not just giving answers and platitudes and flat, quick responses, and he's not answering FAQs like an answering machine. You have to pick up the technique that Jesus often uses in answering questions. He will question the questioner. Oftentimes, he questions the questioner to make the questioner realize the lack of depth of their question, or to kind of evoke a deeper assumption that underlay the question, and to expose the hypocrisy of the questioner. And so he uses the questioning technique. Jesus' style of evangelism is questioning evangelism. Questioning evangelism. Okay, it's a Socratic method. For those of us that are exposed to Greek philosophy and the philosophical style of Greek thinkers, Socrates was the one that popularized the style of teaching by asking questions and questions and questions. Okay, and so Jesus is employing that method. And verse 11, he is asking a question, not so much answering, but also answering through the question. If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it up? Now, this kind of questioning is called as rhetorical questioning. This is a rhetorical question. A question that actually is in the form of a question, but actually contains an answer. That's a brilliant, logical, rational, or a philosophical tool for us to use in our conversational evangelism, conversational apologetics, whatever it is. And verse 12 says, how much more valuable? So after having made his point, he's now illustrating and underlining the point. He's saying, how much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Okay, and then their eyes are all their eyes are opening, and he says, therefore, he concludes. It's almost like premise one, premise two, conclusion. When we construct a philosophical argument, for those of you that have studied logic in college or in school, all the elderly people, I'm sure I understand from my dad that logic was part of your school curriculum. I don't know why they took it off. We would have been much better were it retained. So there is a premise or a statement first, that's called the premise one, then there is a premise two, and then the conclusion follows. So Jesus is kind of following that kind of an argument. So very logically structured argument. And he's finishing the conclusion and saying, therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Okay, we say God's sakes, but here Jesus is using the analogy of what they would do with their sheep, and he's like, sheep's sake, listen to me. For God's sakes, listen to me. Okay. Now, in this sheep example, God is, or Jesus is illustrating the superiority of the human life, the superiority of the human life. He's saying, if you do so much for your sheep, should you not do much more for humans? That's his line of argument. And many times in a land like ours, this question of the equality in value and worth of all life form comes up. The question of why Christians are non-vegetarian comes up. And we are almost scorned and looked down upon, as meat eaters that are not living and let living, because the idea, the Eastern philosophy, especially in the Indian civilization, considers all life forms, quote unquote, equal because of the idea of reincarnation, and therefore we can't say it's a lower life form or whatever. But Jesus seems to be very clearly making a distinction that human life is indeed superior, not just in this verse about the sheep, but he has made prior references in Matthew chapter 6 and Matthew chapter 10 to how the human life is superior over animal life, and it's an important point for us to think. I told you we are at Chai 316, and yesterday I think one student asked us this question. I'm asking this on behalf of my non-Christian friend, and how can Christians be meat eaters and be killing, human life? And then I said, it's a very valid question, it's a very sensitive question. Depending on who is asking, I might want to give a pastoral answer. I might want to refrain from meat eating if that's the deal breaker there. But also, if it's just a logical question, I might want to push back if it is a friend who won't take offense. And I said, when we studied biology in school, high school biology, we studied about living things and non-living things. We said both the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom are living. And so I asked, therefore, as a Jain or as a Buddhist, when you're saying we are consuming plants, isn't it also a life form according to what science tells us and according to what you believe life to be? And so we need to have our frameworks in place to be able to answer people, especially in a country like ours, which is highly sensitized to such topics. So what does Matthew 6 and Matthew 10 actually speak about? He says in Matthew 6, look at the birds of the air, they neither sow nor reap nor gather in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them, showing that they are valuable to him, not that they are to be despised. You are of greater value than they. So obviously, God is the God who created all of this, and he cares for all of this, and he created man and woman to have dominion over all of this and to be kindly governing all of this with love. But he says the crowning glory of his creation obviously is mankind, and therefore there is this idea of the superiority of the human life in the biblical worldview. Similarly, in Matthew 10 again, he says, so don't be afraid, you are worth more than many sparrows. Okay. Now let's move again back into what the Jews and the Pharisees of the day thought about this entire episode. And last week I had given you many Jewish restrictions on the Sabbath and the categorizations that they had. They had 39 categories of restrictions. And here in today's narrative, when Jesus is saying, if your sheep is fallen into a pit, will you not lift it? He is actually appealing to a nuance of one of the 39 categories that borders on lifting. And the subcategories of lifting had different stipulations about how on the Sabbath you can lift a lightweight that was only so heavy, but you could not lift a weight that was heavier. And that was called as Kal Vahomer. Kal Vahomer. So to the Pharisee of that day, when Jesus is talking about lifting a sheep from a pit, it almost would have been absolutely humorous for the onlookers, especially his disciples, and they definitely would have giggled. If I were there and I knew what was happening, I definitely would have giggled and, blurted out laughing. Because Jesus is giving a very sarcastic answer here. Now, you are willing to lift a heavy sheep from the pit that it has fallen into. Now, my act of healing this man does not even require any lifting. And yet, you seem to be implying that I am breaking the Sabbath, is what Jesus is trying to uh, arrive at. Okay? So, these we looked at last week, the 39 Sabbath restrictions with lots of subcategories, almost adding up to 100 plus restrictions. Okay. And so, what Jesus is, in other words, saying is Jesus is saying human needs are to be catered to as something that requires utmost attention. He's saying human needs are not to be ignored. Human needs are not to be sidelined. So Jesus anchors his understanding of the Sabbath in the needs of people. Because last week we spoke at length on why God instituted Sabbath, and the underlying thing about why God instituted Sabbath was that humans had to thrive and humans had to flourish. Humans will only thrive and flourish when the rhythm of work and rest doesn't get disturbed. If we are only going to be burnt out working and working and working and working, we will not thrive in the grand scheme of things. We will burn out fast. We will lose our rhythm fast. We will lose our balance fast. We will lose our integrity fast, our physical integrity, our emotional integrity, and our spiritual integrity being one. Okay? So, the underlying thing about the Sabbath that Jesus is saying is human needs. The reason why Sabbath was instituted was because humans had to thrive, because of the idea of wellness. Now, the Pharisees were taking that totally off tangent, where they are willing to absolutely neglect the glaring human needs right in front of them under the pretext of upholding the Sabbath law. They've totally lost the idea. They've totally forgotten the spirit of the law in trying to be anxiously and obsessively accurate in fulfilling the letter of the law. And therefore, whenever we read a moral restriction in the Bible, including all of the 10 commandments and the other commandments, including the dietary laws and the ceremonial laws and the moral laws, if anybody is doing a study on Deuteronomy or Leviticus, you need to always ask this question: why is this law there in the first place? Somebody famously said, God's 10 commandments are God's tender commandments. Tender commandments. Because behind every commandment, there is this principle of human thriving and human flourishing. There is this principle of protecting humans from harming others and harming themselves. And so Jesus is again bringing the focus back to and reiterating the premium that God has originally placed on human needs. Human needs come before keeping the Sabbath, even though keeping the Sabbath is one of the 10 commandments. I say that again. Human needs come before keeping the Sabbath, even though keeping the Sabbath is one of the 10 commandments. Let me give an example. Let's say you're rushing to church on a Sunday, and it so happens that when you are speeding your way to the church, you find somebody that is in dire need of help. Very quickly in our minds, typically what we will do is we will perhaps sympathize, but we will just turn aside, and that we will drive to our churches and be happy to worship the Lord and praise the Lord, perhaps lead worship or maybe even preach, and then come back satisfied that we have fulfilled our moral obligation. But actually, this is a modern paraphrase of what happens in the parable of the Good Samaritan. The Levite is hurriedly going, obviously, to the house of worship to fulfill his Levitical duty in the service of God. And wanting to be in the service of God, he had forgotten in his hurry to be of service to man, and he is failed to see that a service to man is service to God in a larger sense. So Jesus is saying, yet by meeting human needs on the Sabbath, the commandment is fulfilled and upheld, not abolished. Okay, and that's an important point. Let's look at verse number 13. So Jesus goes ahead and does what he thinks is right and what he wants to illustrate as correct and do an object teaching lesson to all the onlookers, disciples, and the critical Pharisees. So he says to the man, then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. Now, I'm a physical therapist, and I know how muscles behave, and I know that a tightness in a muscle will lead to what is called as a contracture in a muscle, which is irreversible, at least physically. You'll have to do a surgery to release a contracture. And if a contracture is left untreated, it will become a deformity. Now, this man has a certain kind of palsy, and his hand in certain versions, it says, is withered. Okay. So perhaps he had, what, could be a nerve compression, a neuropraxia, or technical terms, neurotomesis or axonatomesis. But obviously, this must have been there for quite a long time, and it is not just simple reversible muscle tightness. Chances are that it was already a contracture, and possibly it was even a deformity. And Jesus is healing him with a word, and I just can't, as a medical professional, bring my head around how he could do that. This is not humanly done. This is not medically done. This is not possible. And yet, Jesus is not even laying his hands on, he is just healing him with a word. And therefore, in the Jewish context and in the context of the Gentile and Pharisee onlookers, the big question and the boiling question was, who is this new rabbi in town? Who is this guy that is speaking with authority? Who is this guy that is speaking beautiful words? Who is this that's performing signs and wonders? Who is the one who is turning tables and making a whip out of cards and driving the money changers? Who is this person? Some are saying he is the Messiah. Some are saying he is the devil himself. Some are saying that he is a blasphemer. Some are saying he is a rabbi. Some are saying he's one of the Old Testament prophets. Some are saying he's John the Baptist that has come back alive. So the perception of people around that time about this person of Jesus was myriad. Not two people were thinking alike about who this Jesus was. And Jesus, in these 3.5 years, was supposed to do the things that were prophesied about him, and through signs and wonders and miracles, he had to show them that he is the Messiah. So he says a word, and the hand, the withered hand, as it were, becomes as sound or as healthy as the other. So this is actually a divinity pointer. Divinity pointer. Today, while we were speaking to a bunch of young people that are doing their, apologetics school, one of the questions was, how do we prove God's existence? Now, proof is a scientific word that is applicable only for scientific realities which are within the physical realm. So I told them the question is phrased a little incorrectly, because we can only prove, things that are provable within the domain of material science. But God is immaterial and God is beyond the domain of the physical. So we refer to God as, in philosophical terms, a metaphysical idea. But I told them there are several pointers to God's divinity. If you ask me proof, like in a lab, in a test tube, no, can't be done, because it is out. God is out of the scope of science, and the instruments of science cannot capture him. Okay, but this particular thing that Jesus is doing on the Sabbath, healing with a word, is a divinity pointer. So the big question was, is there any mark of divinity on this Jesus? Yeah. So this healing confirmed the power of his word, a power that God demonstrated in creation, because creation was made ex nihilo. Ex nihilo means out of, ex nihilo, nothing. So in Genesis 1:1 and in Genesis 2 and Genesis 3, we are seeing how God is speaking the word, and the word goes forth, and everything that we see as created is created in that order with that intentionality. So here again, there is in display a power that God demonstrated in creation that the Jews held in high esteem, and that marked Jesus as God's agent. So when Jesus was doing a word miracle, to us modern readers, it is only one category of miracle that Jesus did. That he healed over distances, that he said a word and healed, he touched and healed, he spat, and out of the spittle and sand, he touched the man's eyes and he healed. He told the man to go and wash himself in the pool at Siloam, and he healed. So these are all different categories of healing to a modern theological or a biblical mind. And that's all it is to us. But to the hearers and the witnesses back in the day when he was doing this, to heal by the power of the word would take a Hebrew mind back to the creation account. Back to the creation account. And that's the reason why John put so much of premium in his prologue to the gospel, where in his beautiful first chapter, he speaks about the word incarnate. In the beginning was the word, and the word was with God, and the word was God. So people, this is just not another spectacular miracle of Jesus. This is a miracle which is a divinity pointer. And oftentimes in our rushed reading of all of these narratives, which we are so familiar with, especially if we are coming from a church or a Christian home or a background, we are losing the beauty of all of these things. And that's the reason why we are doing gigs, and we are looking at God in the Gospels systematically, God in the Gospels slowly, God in the Gospels in a staggered way. And that's how we will be able to understand the beauty and the veracity and the gravitas or the power of what we are reading as we are chewing this cud. The second thing that this miracle points out is not that Jesus is just a word healer, and to a Jewish mind, the word associates himself with God who used the word to create. It also points to Jesus' divinity in another additional way, and that is that this miracle confirms Jesus' lordship over the Sabbath. Now, who was the one that instituted the Sabbath? It is the Lord himself that instituted the Sabbath, and he's the one that upheld the Sabbath by resting on the Sabbath. And he is the one that pronounced Sabbath to be holy, Yahweh, the Father. And now this Jesus seems to have the tenacity and the audacity to say that it is okay for me to cater to a human need on the Sabbath because the spirit of the Sabbath is greater than the letter of the Sabbath. And he will eventually say, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. So this is an amazing, amazing divinity pointer that we tend to miss. Okay. The next interesting thing, if you are reading between the lines about this very familiar miracle that we have read an umpteen number of times in the past, is that, and this could sound controversial to many of you, is that there is no mention of faith. Yeah. Now, faith has a high premium, and faith is absolutely front and center. Sola fide is how we get saved. I'm not trying to reduce the premium and the importance and the value and the weight on the idea of faith. But there is another extrapolation of faith that keeps commonly happening in church circles, where signs and wonders do happen even today, where if somebody comes expectantly for their healing and their healing doesn't happen, the common thing that the faith healer, quote unquote, or the servant of God says is that perhaps you didn't pray with enough faith. And to those kind of people that are skewing the idea of faith in Jesus to their extreme fancies, I want to invite you to see that in this narrative, there is no mention of this man's faith. Now, again, I'm not overreading into this text. I'm just pointing out that the elephant in the room is the lack of mention of this person's faith. Now, chances are that Matthew did not want to, weigh in too heavily on the idea of faith, and that his purpose writing this narrative could have been to expound the idea of the Sabbath more or the divinity of Jesus more. All of those are possibilities. But for the hyper faith person that is slapping lack of faith on people that apparently don't get healed, the question to ask is that in this passage where Jesus heals with a word, controversially, willingly taking the trouble of healing on the Sabbath, a healing that will never be sidelined because it happened on one of the most controversial days, does not have a mention of faith. Maybe in the narrative, the mention of faith, may not have been been given so much of importance because Matthew wanted to focus on Jesus and the Pharisees and not on the man himself or the event which could be a detractor. But whatever it is, we just have to realize that the word faith is not mentioned. Okay, so we need to be a little more understanding when we tell people that are desperately wanting their healings and coming to Jesus and don't get healed. Never tell them, maybe you didn't have enough faith. That could be the unkindest thing that you could ever tell anybody. Okay. The next one, Jesus referred to Hosea 6:6 in verse number 7. And I have put that verse here. For I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings. Now, the big question in any of our minds could be, did Jesus actually break the Mosaic law? And how could we say that he came to fulfill and uphold all the law? Actually, Jesus is not breaking the Mosaic law. It looks like he is breaking the Mosaic law because we have understood this specific Mosaic law wrongly. And what we need to understand before we come to the question of the law is, between the law and mercy, God seems to default towards mercy. Between burnt offerings and mercy, God seems to be defaulting on mercy. Or in other words, all of God's laws are given with human needs and human protection and human safety and human thriving and human flourishing as the common base. And therefore, the spirit of the law always was inclined towards mercy and human needs. So Jesus was not breaking the Mosaic law. He was upholding the real spirit of the law. It might look like that he was breaking the letter of the law. Okay? Now again, compassion over ritual is the big theme that we need to get out of last week's study and this week's study. Compassion over ritual. Now, many of us are caught up, unfortunately, in the externals of Christianity, in the rituals of Christianity. Now, when we think of our friends of other faith, Eastern faith, we think of Riti Rivaj. And we think they are people that are given to rituals. But in actuality, you know what? Even we are monotonously, thoughtlessly following several rituals. And Jesus is trying to say that compassion always trumps rituals. So he's putting compassion before ritual. And in this case, Sabbath observance was the ritual. Because that's what the Pharisees taught, the law taught. Okay, and so all of this is happening. The disciples eating corn happened. And then this healing happened. So there are two instances back to back that are happening. And the Pharisees have caught Jesus' disciple and Jesus red-handed, as it were. And so the plot was thickening, and it is all very ripe for another larger plot in the grand scheme of things. And that was mission murder. It's very interesting as to how both of these groups are thinking that they are doing God's mission. The Pharisees were thinking that they were zealously upholding the law and therefore safeguarding the Mosaic tradition and preventing people from coming and quote unquote liberalizing Mosaic law. So they were preserving in their minds and hearts and heads, okay, the sanctity of the Mosaic law as it was given to them. But here on the other side, Jesus is advancing God's mission. Jesus himself is the mission of God. So each side is thinking that they are actually doing the mission of God. And clearly, the Pharisees had no clue that in trying to uphold God's mission, they are actually being counterproductive to God's mission. And so, really, when the Pharisees are now unfurling mission murder, little did they know that they were playing into God's grand meta narrative that's going to unfold on Via Dolorosa, the way to Calvary. So, in their excessive religious zeal, the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. So there are several times that this happens in the past, but this is like the last straw on the camel's back. Okay? This is that decisive watershed moment when they were collectively deciding to reject the Messiah as a nation. Now, who were the Pharisees? The Pharisees were the moral policemen, and the Pharisees were committed to upholding the law, Mosaic law, as best as they could, so much so that each of them had a ceremonial cleansing tank in front of their house, and they were scrupulous in how they upheld the law themselves. And so the Pharisees were very important people, that anybody that wanted to check out if Jesus was the Messiah or not would go to and ask, because that's the distinction that the Pharisees had as religious leaders of the day. And if there were a television channel and a television interviewer, definitely one of the Pharisees would have had the mic. So here, this robust religious group committed to high levels of quote unquote religiosity was collectively deciding to pass this verdict and come to the conclusion that this Jesus is not the Messiah, cannot be the Messiah on several accounts. Here in this narrative, his disciples' behavior and Jesus condoning it and even supporting it. Healing on the Sabbath, not just once, 7 Sabbath falls in all the 4 Gospels, and then eating with sinners and tax collectors, and blaspheming about his co-equality with God. So the Pharisees are looking only at the law, and they are missing the beauty and the divinity of Jesus through all of the prophecies. Now, the Jewish scriptures were divided into, the Tanakh was divided into the law and the prophets and the writings, 3 categories. Now, while they were so focused on the law and they were reading the law with a microscope, they had pushed away the prophets and the prophecies about how the Messiah will come fulfilling all of these prophecies. And again, that's a good lesson for us. We can't take one part of the truth and exalt that part of the truth to the insult of the other. Now, many times when we speak about the attributes of God, we all speak about the love of God. God is love, God is mercy. and God is just and all of that. But God has many attributes. And if we exalt one attribute of God to its maximum, or even beyond the boundaries of its maximum, we're always doing it at the danger of diminishing another attribute of God. Because God is perfect in all his attributes. He's 100% love and he's 100% mercy, but he's also 100% just and he's 100% consuming fire. So we can't pick and choose the attributes of God. Here, what's happening is, a lot of attention is given to the law, but the prophecies of Jesus are out of the window. And they are looking with tunneled vision at this Messiah and missing the Messiah. So this particular verse of them deciding to kill Jesus takes the official rejection of Messiah further than it has gone before in the Gospel of Matthew. It is actually the culminating point of the opposition of Jewish religious authorities. Okay? Now, this is the next section that I have, but maybe we'll just do this verse and probably go till 8:30 and I'll stop wherever I need to. Okay, so let's move now to episode or event number 47 out of the 250 events in the gospel. Now, all of this is happening. And verse 15, a continuation of this. Aware of this, Jesus withdrew from that place. A large crowd followed him, and he healed all who were ill. That's very interesting. One group is looking at the same Jesus through the Pharisaic eyes, their colored eyes, as it were, and they are looking at him as a man that doesn't deserve to live anymore. Another group is looking at the same Jesus and wants to pursue him, wants to follow him, wants to benefit from him, and hopes to get healed through his ability and power to heal. How interesting. How interesting. The same messenger, the same person, the same good things that he is doing. One group perceives him to be wicked and wrong. The other group is beginning to see that he is the Messiah. And so in our evangelistic efforts, oftentimes, we need to understand and have the appreciation that not all of the people that we are trying to share the gospel with are going to favorably respond to the gospel. And certain points to you might look like, I got this so easy and this is such a powerful point that impacts me. How are they missing the obvious? It's very possible to miss the obvious because everybody has a pair of glasses. Even if you're not wearing glasses this evening, everybody has a pair of glasses through which we look at the world. And this pair of imaginary glasses that we look at the world through is called your worldview. So for a friend of another faith, he will be looking at the world from his worldview, from his colored tinted glass. And therefore, we have to understand that not everybody is going to respond favorably to the same message. And therefore, for people, missionaries, Christian workers out there in far-flung areas doing very difficult work in the front lines, a word of encouragement. Okay, it is only important that we sow, because always it is the Lord that takes care of the harvest. You don't have to worry about why certain seeds that we had sown have not come to fruition yet. We have sown it faithfully, God will bring somebody else to water it faithfully, and then God will send somebody else to reap it faithfully. As long as you have been faithful in doing what you were asked to do, you will get the affirmation and the validation and the appreciation and a pat on the back from God Himself saying, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Not successful, not significant. Faithful is the catchword in Christian ministry. It's not about how well, how much. It is about your faithfulness to whatever the Lord has given in your hands. Okay. Another important thing in this verse that you may need to understand is that Jesus, being God Himself in the flesh, is not thinking. What is that? Somebody has to mute your mic. Yeah. So Jesus, being God Himself, is not thinking that it is cowardly to withdraw to a safe place. Now, there's a lot of talk of persecution, and I know, from reliable sources, that's lots of unrest up north. And my father-in-law and mother-in-law were in Lucknow for 30 plus years serving the Lord, and they have reliable sources that give them information about what's happening there and in the thereabouts, and the scene is not great. Many times when a Christian worker or a Christian minister or a missionary or an evangelist or a preacher, teacher is facing persecution, the big question in that person's heart, if you've ever been there, is, do I stay? Do I flee? Do I stay? Do I flee? And now it looks very heroic to stay, and it looks very cowardly to flee. But I want to draw your attention this evening to this verse where Jesus, aware of this impending threat to his life, Jesus withdraws from that place, moves away from that place to a safer place. Now, would we call this action to be a cowardly action? I would say this is wise action, and we have great precedence in the Messiah himself that it is not cowardly to go towards safety, especially if you know clearly that the mission that God has entrusted into your hands has not come to a close. Now, this is probably happening around the middle of Jesus's ministry, 1.5 years or so. And Jesus knows that there is much more ministry and much more teaching and much more investment that has to happen before he has to bravely walk towards Golgotha. And therefore, this is not cowardice. This is actually wisdom and discernment. And I pray and hope that our missionary brothers and sisters in pockets of persecution will not presumptuously, unnecessarily, and prematurely throw away their lives when it's not required for them to do, especially when their task that the Lord has given to them is not over yet. So, in the pretext of being brave, we don't have to unwisely walk into the epicenter of trouble. It's important that we need to be wise about these things and take scriptural precedent and look at what the Messiah himself did. Now, I'm sure nobody can be more braver than the Messiah himself. And therefore, let's not unnecessarily flaunt our bravery and chivalry where it's not required. prematurely. Okay, so it's 8:33 and I'm going to stop here. Maybe we can do a Q&A and then we'll continue the rest of event 47 in the coming week. Any questions? Any comments? Any pushback?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So without law and order like the Sabbath, which was established by God Himself, won't
Uh-huh.
we won't we veer off on our own way and justify it with our own logic, citing human needs? Where do we draw the
Well,
line? Should compassion always trump
Sandeep,
the
Sandeep,
law?
Sandeep, can you speak a little softer? It's
Okay,
echoing a lot for me. Maybe something wrong from my side. Yeah, it's too shrill and it's echoey.
sure.
Something about the Sabbath. Yeah.
Yeah, I was saying without law and order, like the
Yeah.
Sabbath, which was
Mm.
established by God Himself,
Yes.
won't we veer off on our own way and justify it, saying it's logic and cite human needs? Where
Mm.
do we draw the line? Should
No,
compassion
so
always precede law?
yeah, compassion always has to precede law because the law is based on the principle of compassion. Yeah. So nobody is recommending that we actually do away with the Sabbath, the idea of uh, work and then rest as part of human rhythm. We are saying, as New Testament Christians also, that the cycle of work and rest, the cycle of work and rest, that's precisely what we spent the entire study last week doing. The importance of the Sabbath is what we saw. But when the idea of the Sabbath rest, which is primarily instituted for our flourishing and our neighbor's flourishing, is actually coming in the way of them flourishing, when there is a human need which we don't want to cater to, quoting the letter of the law without understanding the spirit of the law, that is when we are missing the crux of the Sabbath rest. Yeah, so there has to be a Sabbath. There has to be a Sabbath. There has to be the micro idea of Sabbath and the macro idea of Sabbath. We need to have Sabbaths in a micro sense every day. That's why we are awake for 18 hours and we sleep for 6 hours every day, right? And then there is this weekly idea of the Sabbath where we are working 6 days a week and we are resting 1 day a week. There also has to be weaved in seasons of rest, perhaps once a month, once in 3 months, once in 6 months, once a year, depending on what you feel is necessary to be a rhythm to recharge you before God, spiritually, emotionally, and physically in your own life. So I'm not I'm not doing away with it. In fact, I'm actually saying that all of us should do that very deliberately. But on our way to church, if there is a scenario where we are ignoring a human need so that we will, check our, Sunday church going box, I am saying that is a bad reading of the idea of the Sabbath. I'm not saying on the Sabbath you go and look for human needs in all possible places and use that as a better option than going and listening to boring sermons in our churches or whatever. So I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is if a human need shows up and we are in the vicinity and we have the means and the ability to cater to that need, well, that need is more important in the eyes of God than us having checked a box in our religious ritual of, say, attending a church service. And that won't happen 52 on 52 weeks. So, Sandeep, you still need to go to church. Yeah, I don't know if I did justice to your question, or is that what you were asking actually?
Yeah, that was what I was asking. Just for an example, what if I want to sleep in on a Sunday morning, don't want to go to church?
Yeah,
Should should the church
okay.
leader actually probably say should come to church? This discipline also is there, right?
Yeah. And I don't think I said anything about that. I said, uh, why can't you go to church and then come and sleep in the rest of the day? So, yes, we all need rest for our bodies. Okay. And that is pertaining to our human need. But what I was trying to say was in the context of somebody else's need, right? While sleeping in, you are only catering selfishly to your need. Maybe you were exhausted, and if you needed that rest, please go ahead and rest and then go for an evening service or whatever. I don't know. Yeah, but that's a rarity, right? That's an exception to the rule. That's not going to happen week after week. If it happens, then I know that your priorities are in the wrong place and that you're just using it as an excuse. But I'm talking about a real human need that a neighbor has, and that how in our religiosity we cannot overlook it, thinking that we are doing a greater service of obeying the law, when, first of all, the law rests on the spirit of serving humanity and helping humanity thrive and flourish. Yeah, maybe I'm not saying it well enough, but I hope you're getting the idea.
Yeah, I got it. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Any other comments? Any other questions?
Hi, Charles. It's Calvin here.
Yes, Calvin. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So, a few things is one is the last section you did on verse 15, about the persecution. So I mean, I haven't seen this verse as a, as an inference of persecution, or it could be, uh, what I mean is I haven't seen these words as a words of persecution or anything. I thought that it's very ongoing with Pharisees and Jesus. So yeah, so what you said was really encouraging. That's what I wanted to say. And I think it happens back to back. Yesterday, I was listening a sermon, and it was also uh, about the persecution and how wisdomfully you have to deal with that. And just a couple of days back, uh, two places in Ahmedabad actually Sunday service. So they were doing Sunday service on commercial complex, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and then
Yes.
these other people went there and they tried stopping and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. One of the
Mm-hmm.
person who did this was actually living in my society, so I see him every day. RSS,
Mm-hmm.
DGP guys. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I was really in a mood that, I might give him a fivefold ministry or something like that. Yeah, but on the WhatsApp, he was posting that this is how. I mean, he actually posted the two, three videos of how they went there, they video all, and they were arguing with the pastors, and then at the end that we were saying that we finally stopped this, and this is Sanskruti and something like that. So I was
Mhm.
for a couple of days, I was really not unrest but wrestling about how to do this, but
Mm.
yeah, so today's your short message on verse 15 was really encouraging. So, and yeah, we need a wisdom when to withdraw and when to stay there. That's very
Sure.
critical. Yeah.
Sure.
I've been grew in missionary family. We've been serving in villages, so I know the
Mm.
spot to
Mm.
decide whether to flee or whether to stay. And it's very, very,
Right.
very
Right.
critical at that point to do that, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So thank you for that. Other thing, so, and there was another study going on here in Ahmedabad. You might heard of, I don't remember the name, but as you were saying
Mhm.
that this is a kind of an official rejection of Jesus as a
Mhm.
Messiah.
Mhm.
And they were saying that the official rejection of Messiah happens on the same passage, but on, verse 22 onwards, when they,
Oh, okay.
yeah, when they said that, that can this be a son of David? Because there was
Mm.
a ongoing, what
Debate.
say,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
saying that,
Contemplation. Mm.
yeah,
Mm.
that one who will heal the deaf and mute person, this be
Mm.
a sign of Messiah, and then Pharisees
Mm.
quote that he is doing by the prince of demon, and they eventually,
Mm. Mm.
they're saying against the spirit, and that is the 22 to 32. That's the where they're saying that this is the official rejection of Messiah. So, and
Sure.
not to
It
agree,
seems
disagree, but yeah, the same
no, no,
idea.
no,
So
no.
I
That
wanted to, yeah.
that seems more likely, and that seems more likely, and that seems more credible. And so, thank you for mentioning that. And sorry about me prematurely saying
No, no, no,
that
no,
this was
no,
a
no. That's
national
but it is
rejection.
going there. Yeah, I mean, it's
Sure, it
just
is. We are
a
getting
day
there.
before or
Yeah,
something. Yeah, it's
and I
getting there.
think things are brewing. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But thank you so much, Kelvin, for saying that. And uh, the other thing about wisdom in play, in decisions about staying, moving to safety in the context of persecution. Thank you. Right.
And
So yes, go ahead.
yeah, I mean, this is kind of funny questions. Like this is Sabbath for rest. We have a Sunday
Mhm.
services. I mean, the Sunday is exhausting. You have service and then you have other things and things.
Yeah.
It's not actually day of rest. It's like you are working in church. I mean, I don't do
Correct.
this, but they for many
Correct.
people. So
Correct.
kind of
Correct.
little
Correct.
contradictory, but this is very, very common
E-
question, whether it's a day of
yes.
rest or should
Yes.
we
Yes.
should we
Yes.
worship or don't do this? I mean, so what's your take on it? That's what I wanted to hear.
Yeah. So the idea of the Sabbath originally was for us to cease from our regular commercial uh, pursuits of earning for a living, so to speak, right? So back in the day, there was work 6 days a week, and then it was the Sabbath, and they all had to rest as a nation, in contrast to all that the surrounding nations did. And once every 6 years were over, they should not farm for another 1 year. And once 49 years were over, they had to celebrate the year of Jubilee, and they had a set of laws about giving back anything that anybody owed to you and restoring. So, this entire idea of Sabbath is speaking about rest for the human body, rest to the land, and rest to anybody toiling to redeem theirs back again. Okay, and so the idea is not just an idea of everyday rest, every weekly rest for the human body. Yeah, so while physical rest is what is happening, there is also on the day of Sabbath a deliberate contemplation along with the Lord about the beauty and the grandeur of God's creation. And as it were, we mentioned this last week, we are celebrating and reminiscing on the work of the Lord and enjoying it along with Him. And when we go to worship services, if you are a member of the congregation, you are pretty much doing that. And in many ways, it may be physically tiring, but it is spiritually very rejuvenating because we don't spend that amount of time during our work week that we are devoting exclusively to the Lord. So, man is a spirit who has a soul, who lives in a body, and therefore, the idea of human personhood contains spirit slash soul slash body. And while we are sleeping and resting or ceasing from work, our bodies are getting recharged. And while we are in the pursuit of the Lord's work, if you do not, wear out yourself like some of us many times do, you are actually getting recharged. And Jesus last week, in the passage that we looked at last week, speaking about the Levites that are serving in the temple on the Sabbath. So he is actually, as a rebuttal to the Pharisees, saying the Levites are serving in the church on the Sabbath. So if your idea of work is, okay, inclusive of the work that is being done in the church also, then what is your answer to that? He's asking it as a rhetorical question. So my contention is that there are ministers that burn themselves out, and in trying to give, they are drawing out from the very little that they have, and they are quickly running dry and they are burning out. So that's why I think in most Christian ministry circles, in church circles especially, Monday is a day of rest for the pastors. Okay, if they are expending themselves physically on a Sunday by serving physically on a Sunday their congregation, then their body is getting the downtime on a Monday. Spiritually, when they are giving on a Sunday, and if they are not excessively doing it from a place of want and spiritual starvation, I think they're not burning themselves out, but they are recharging, because on the Sabbath day, the Lord is setting it apart wholly for us to shift our minds and our focus and to give more reflection and thought to fellowshipping with Him, which is what I think in church services a typical pastor generally does. But again, a word of caution, there are many ministers that burn themselves away without seasons of rest and refreshing. And that's why there are many things that go wrong in Christian ministries. While I was part of the Eitnerin ministry, the organization that I worked for, thankfully, after a ministry trip, would give us a day off for us to recharge. And so I think we have to creatively bring in all of these elements and understand the intent of the Sabbath and try to see that we safeguard this rhythm of rest. And we can do it creatively, and we don't have to do it rigidly, saying it's only Sunday or it's only this day or that day, but do it based on how much ever your body needs to keep that rhythm and balance. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. And is there any other question that anybody has? It's 8:53. Any questions? Any comments? Okay. So may I request Brother Kelvin to pray for us and close?
Yeah. Uh,
Yeah.
Father, thank you for this day and this evening. Thank you for this wonderful study of your words, and not just study, but thank you for drawing out a lot of wisdom and compassion and word of encouragement, Father. Thank you for all of this. Father, we submit ourselves into your mighty hands that we may obtain wisdom and care and whatever we need to serve you and serve our neighbors and other peoples in this dire time, Father. Father, we pray and thank you for Charles and his ministry. Bless him and his family with your riches and abundance and in your grace that he may increase and then he may minister with truthfully and loving kindness, Father. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much, Brother Calvin. And thank you, everybody, for